In high school, my senior English teacher was famous for studying Shakespeare during the senior year at our school. And like many first-time students of Shakespeare, we read some of Shakespeare's sonnets, and I started to fancy myself a bit of a poet. Now, I did not become, obviously, the next great American poet, but it was a very interesting process in that it was the first thing that I had consciously studied where I really started to understand how working within a system, a frame of discipline, can, in the end, free you. So I started writing sonnets in meter and verse, and eventually what you start to realize is that it allows you to focus on the content as opposed to focusing on the form. And so eventually the form just kind of melts away and you are just purely focused on the content, and then eventually you can stop using the rhyme and meter and then continue on. But it was the first time I really understood that. I was an unruly child. I think our listeners who have heard me on previous podcasts will guess that I was a opponent of authority in many ways as a kid. I rebelled quite a bit. And this was one of the first times that I really realized how discipline can be effective in really making you more free on the back end. That is our intro to episode 49 of the Valuability Podcast. The topic, obviously, is discipline. The Valuability Podcast is for anyone interested in financial planning, business, leadership, and personal development. Whether you are a financial professional, business owner, individual investor, or employee, we believe that financial success comes from creating a plan on the foundation of your values, and building your ability will get you there. My name is Danforth Fleek. I'm joined each week by my co-host, friend, and mentor, Philip Simonson. We have been in the financial services industry for 20 and 40 years, respectively, both as financial advisors and in a wide range of roles on the wholesale and retail sides of the business. Now, Philip, we have started out our values episodes in the past with a definition of the value. So let's start out with a definition of discipline.
Yes, please.
Discipline is action or inaction that is regulated to be in accordance with a particular system of governance. Now, I know you wanted to start out with a parable, but I did also want to take a quick second to mention that next week is our 1-year anniversary. We're coming up on our 50th episode, and we took a couple weeks off at holiday time at the end of last year. So congratulations on our first year, but go ahead and start out with the parable that you wanted to share.
Yes, and also for our listeners, one of the reasons why besides the COVID, and we were looking for something to do, and you reached out to me. What intrigued me about starting these podcasts was I never had a grandfather that was living when I was born. So I always thought, well, this is just one way, for my children and grandchildren, future generations, for them to get to know me a bit. And today, Dan, Parker, our youngest son, and his wife, Lisa, she gave birth to Quinn Margaret.
Awesome.
Yeah. So this parable, I thought it'd be apropos. And an old Cherokee chief was teaching his grandchild about life. And he said, look, a fight is going on inside me here. And it's a terrible fight. And it's between two wolves. Now, one is evil. And this one, he has these attributes or characteristics. He's angry, he's envy, he's sorrow, he's greedy, he has regret, he's arrogant, a lot of self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies. Key one here is false pride, leads to thinking superior, self-doubt, and ego. The ego, you've heard us say before, is edging God out. But the other one is, it's good. Now, this wolf, he has joy, he has peace, he has love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going to be going on inside of you, the grandfather says to his grandchild, and every other person too. Well, the grandchild thought about it for a minute and then asked the grandfather, which wolf will win? And the grandfather, without any hesitation, says, the one you feed. And this whole discipline, as you had mentioned, Dan, I'd like to just start off, in our talk today about it I wanted to focus on the self, because if you cannot lead yourself, we said this in one of our other most recent podcasts on the values, it will be challenging to lead others. And note, first you got to define the definition of leadership, and leadership is about influence. So if you can't manage yourself and you can't demonstrate to others that you are able to manage yourself and make good decisions, well, then you can't expect them to be willing to follow you. So discipline in this respect is the most vital matter of all matters, in my opinion. And it does start, as you said, in childhood. Not for everyone, but that's where it should start. Because without discipline, a person's just going to be like, I live on a lake. It's like a ship without a rudder. So learning how to practice discipline at an early age, it's going to lead to that, to each individual who was able to do it, to progress, to prosper, to become a better partner, have a better family, also be a better teammate, and leader at the ultimate end. And the why, because is for that is, and Dan, yeah, might want to build on this, but it's because in life, it's about self mastery, and that's learning. Example of self mastery. You and I have talked about this in some of our earlier podcasts that you mentioned. It's just learning how to live with delayed gratification and putting yourself first in the payroll line. If you can't pay yourself first, you're never going to become financially prosperous. If you can't learn to manage your time better, you're never going to achieve the things that you want to have in life. So it does need to start at an early age.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you mention that, and I didn't intend to really start out along these lines, but this is often how our conversations go. We start out and then something clicks. Later in life, I really had issues. I would say in my late 20s, early 30s, looking back at my childhood. My mother was permissive, not totally permissive, but she gave me a lot of room for that disobedience, for that inability to follow the rules. Now, she never just let me run riot. She would always make me remove myself from the situation. So I spent a lot of time as a kid either in the car or in my room. So she wouldn't let me stay in society and not be obedient, but she never came down on me. She never cracked down on me. She never forced me to find discipline. She never enforced discipline, I think is probably the best way to say it. And in my late 20s and early 30s, I started to really resent that, because I started to look at it from the standpoint of, well, if she had cracked down on me, then maybe I would have figured out some of this sooner. And then as I've gotten into my 40s, I've flip-flopped back to, no, my mother really did understand that she was approaching it the right way. You have to find discipline yourself. It can be forced upon you, but if it's forced upon you, it alters you in ways that people spend, tens of thousands of dollars in therapy trying to fix. But she gave me that room, let me be who I was, wouldn't let me, you know, upset other people or ruin the society that we were in. But she knew that I needed to find that myself. And so later in my life, as I started to find that self discipline, it allowed me then to apply it in my life. And then we'll talk in a little bit about some of my experiences around applying discipline in a management setting.
Mm.
But I just thought it was very, very interesting from that standpoint that you're absolutely right that there is this battle in your youth to find the level at which you can interact with the society around you. And some people like me have an inability to work within those rules, but it's it can be very, very dangerous to enforce and be heavy-handed in enforcing that discipline. And I think it goes back to the opening story in that you have to find that discipline naturally and understand it and believe it yourself. When somebody else forces it on you, then you become resentful and you just never, you may learn to exist within that, but it certainly isn't a healthy way to approach it.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's again some of these conversations we start off, but you triggered something as well with me, and I'm going back to that definition: inaction or action. Mine was more inaction. I learned it very early, and some of our listeners have heard it before. I couldn't. I had a disease. They call it the Forrest Gump disease. Perthes disease. Bottom line, I couldn't walk on my right leg for like 2.5 years, from age 4 to almost 7. Had to go to kindergarten. Had this brace, etc. But I can never forget being in that doctor's office. He said, "Now look, that boy in there. He was a bit older than me. He's not. He's gonna. I don't know if he's ever gonna get out of this brace because he doesn't listen. When you're not in this brace, you need to be in wearing, using your crutches, and this you can't put any weight on this right leg because your hip, it's very malleable, and it'll never form properly. So I learned that discipline, and I remember adhering to it. I also remember then, boy, once I got that brace off, look out. Do you think I was going to sit still? Heck no, I was just moving. And report cards would come in all through elementary. Got to um, oh geez, C student, really, maybe a few B's here and there, but conduct, that was always D's. That was always F's.
It's because you were overactive.
Oh yeah, the parents. Look, I had to be. I was confined for a couple years. So that brace came off, and like the teacher said, when Philip comes to class, and if he wants to behave, the class will behave that day. If he doesn't want to behave, then the whole class doesn't behave. He's
The
just
ringleader.
right. So he knew that. And leadership came fairly early, and I think it was also, I as a boy, and they held me. Our birthday was October 19th, so they held me back, and I naturally, for 1 year because of the brace, and I think I missed I'm certain in Minnesota I missed the deadline. But my father, we talked about the power of questions and the wow questions and going back and using the what. So I'll never forget my father, 7th grade. He's done, I got the whoopings, never really severe, but got, it put in a room, got grounded from this or that. Finally took me for a ride in the car and said, look, he pulled the car up to some guys digging the ditch for the county. He says, get out of the car. Go ask those guys. They're about 40 years old. Ask them if they could do their life all over again. Would they have studied harder in school to maybe then go on and get a college degree so that, and then while you're there ask them how their back's feeling. I said, no, I don't need to do that. He said, oh, I think you do. Because you're not listening to me. and you have to come up with this lesson yourself." And I said, "Well, what's the lesson?" He says, "I think you know it, but I'll sum it up real quick. There's two ways to make a living in this world. One's from the head up and one's from the head down. The way you're going at it, it's from the head down. That's okay if that's your passion is to dig holes and dig ditches. Just hopefully you rise up and you run the company someday. But you need to start applying yourself." And so you're right. We had to have a job. I mean, I had to have a job by the time if you're 12 years old, you've got a job. You don't quit that job till you have another job. So he gave us, it was more of a, what would you say, a velvet glove, but he gave us discipline, gave us boundaries. And when once I taught us situational leadership from, in most Fortune 100 companies, situational leadership, 80% of them have put their leaders through it. And that's where I get that definition. Leadership comes down to one word: influence. But what I heard from this speaker on this topic, he said, look, the number one indicator if someone is going to be successful in life is self accountability / self discipline. And in that fashion, you think about it, accountability literally means, owning the ability to account for your own life. You're answerable to your own obligations, your own duties, and it's your life. You have to figure out, just as you were saying, Dan, you have to figure out for yourself why you need to get self-discipline, because otherwise you're never going to own it. And I think that's the key. And it comes down to daily accountability and establishing a foundation of honesty to yourself. And if you can be honest to yourself, because as you rightfully also said, and didn't say it in these words, but it's that self-talk, that's 6 inches between our ears that we're listening to. And it's just what the Cherokee chief said to his grandchild. It's the one you feed. So who are you going to be listening to? On one shoulder you got Jiminy Cricket, and the other shoulder you got Slick Willie talking to you.
It's the Animal House, the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other, right?
Right. Now we're dating ourselves, but that's right. And so what I then also learned, and people in our audience have heard this before, that you shake my family tree, a bunch of CIAs fall out of it, Catholic Irish alcoholics. And that whole disease, and I do believe it is a disease, but it's a me disease, it's a selfish disease. And the number one thing, if once you start getting a hold of it and creating, you learn to be honest to yourself first, because you've been deceiving yourself for so long. And why people won't change, and even in that disease, no one goes through the door to AA 1 minute before they're ready. They don't go through it until they're willing to admit, I need to change. In that car with my dad with the ditch, I know I needed to start changing. I ended up becoming a National Honors student. I got my act together. But and I started hanging around some different people. I was not hanging around the right people back then. At that time, I was going down a different path. So the truth about change, you're generally not going to see it, because most of the time you never get the gratitude of seeing it each day. So if you do accept that I am going to take the necessary steps to start making change happen in my life and getting more self-discipline, well, the next thing you see is that mountain, and that mountain can look horrendous. And again, going back to AA, they figured out that look, you're asking a person to stop drinking and then for the rest of their life, but they figured out, wait a minute, stop. What we're going to do is ask someone to stop drinking. Just go 1 day at a time. And if you can do the 1 day at a time deal, you're going to start establishing better habits, and bad habits will go away. But that change is slow, and it oftentimes you don't see it. So I really um, think, Dan, and I'll let you talk about your. I know you've got your story about leading others and your first time in management, but I'd like to then, after you're done, throw it back. And what's the 64? It's the $64,000 question. So how do I get started on this? And and
Sure.
and we can go through some simple steps for our listeners.
Yeah, one quick story is you mentioned the idea that this change happens slowly over your lifetime. You look back at things, and as you get older, you start to notice the moments in your life where you can see these changes happening. For me, a big one was physical rehab after surgeries. So I had shoulder surgery when I was 21 years old on my right shoulder. I had wrecked my right shoulder in high school and it was dislocating all the time. So they did actually, the day I was supposed to graduate from college, I actually had surgery because my health insurance lapsed the next day because I fell off my dad's insurance. So I finished my college degree. And then instead of going to my
Graduation
award
ceremony. Yep.
ceremony, the graduation ceremony, I went to the hospital and had surgery. Didn't do any other rehab, not one bit. And to this day, I can raise my right arm about 20 degrees above my head, but I
Wow.
can't really do much else with it. And then at 35, I had surgery on my right big toe. Did, I would say, about 50% of the rehab there, and the problem actually ended up coming back a little bit because I didn't do all of the rehab. Then at 40, I had surgery on my left foot, my Achilles tendon on my left foot. I did so much rehab on my left foot that I ended up making it so much stronger than my right foot that I had to start doing the exercises on my right foot. When I was doing jumping jacks and things like that, I would end up hurting the muscles in my right leg because they weren't as strong as the muscles in my left leg because I had decided I'm going to do all of this rehab every night and I'm going to do it twice. So you could see the progression over your life of those things. And that one just jumps out at me that, hey, I started to get the idea that, you know what, the doctor knows what they're talking about. Follow, right? Rocket science, right? It's not rocket science.
Some people get it right away. Some take months, sometimes it's years, decades, but
Yeah, it only took me about 20 years to figure it out all the way. But to your point, in terms of leadership, aside from you, who of course is the best leader that I've ever worked for,
too
that
kind.
that was also hard for me to see at the time. I mention it to people all the time. I was talking to a good friend of mine just this morning and saying that had I gone to a different organization and not been, blessed to have worked with you right out of school, I would not have seen the situational leadership, and in fact where you learned it from was on the vanguard of that, correct?
Correct.
IDS, American Express, was really one of the leaders in being teaching leadership the way that they did, correct?
Harvey Golub, he was the managing director of McKinsey and Company, and then when Sandy
Right.
Weil was running Amex, said, "Go find me a fuller brush sales company like, in the financial services because the IRAs." He said, gave it to Harvey, and Harvey picked IDS. They paid $1 billion. The only thing he did, he brought in Jeff Stiefler as the head of marketing at the time, and he taught situational leadership.
Right.
We're going to share this common language.
To me, it seemed absolutely normal. Like, it took me quite a while after I left because we were together for 5 years, right at the beginning of my career. And then I went on to work at a number of other places right after that. For about 2 years at a time, I was at 3 or 4 different places. So I saw a bunch of different other leadership styles. And it took me a while to really realize, hey, not every place is run the way I was originally taught how leadership should work. And so it wasn't until I got my second greatest leader in my career, a woman named Steph Kinney,
Mm.
and I started to recognize the things in her that I really appreciated. And the biggest of those was discipline. She was very punctual. If we were going to have a one-on-one, we had it. If we had an agenda, we stuck to the agenda. I knew that she was going to be asking about the projects that I was working on. I knew that she was going to want me to have progressed in those projects since the last time we talked. And it really made me start to realize I got her as a boss after I had left being a manager. And the reason why I moved over into her department, she was in training, was that we had 8 managers, the company had contracted, and they didn't want to fire people, so they were looking to move 2 of us. Well, I had been one of the newest hires from the management standpoint, but my boss over there was a good boss, was very truthful with me. He just said, "Look, this really doesn't have anything to do with time. You're just not a very good manager. You need to go do something else." And he was right. He was absolutely right. And the thing that I really lacked, it, and Steph showed this to me, was that discipline. I was not good one-on-ones. If we had them scheduled, if things got busy, I would, push them off. I was always disorganized. I rarely had an agenda. I did meetings off the cuff. And, when you're in that role for the first time, the good ones make it look easy, and it's not at all. And you need to approach it from an aspect of discipline that I just did not have, and it really did show in the end. Also, I really didn't prefer it. That doesn't ever help,
Right.
right? If you don't have passion for
You
it,
don't have the willingness, and so
right?
yeah, that's exactly that brings us to the point. Then, so how can you learn this self discipline? And I'd say, I'm going to give you a 6-step process, and then we'll take it home here and do our article review. But the first thing I would encourage, or is at your work, if you happen to be working for someone else, and is ask your boss to well, seek clarification from your boss about your roles and responsibilities. But if you already think you know what they are, here's a way to clarify it and go back to him or her. And that is, look, if we're sitting down a year from today and you've said we've, knocked the ball, I have knocked the ball out of the park, what must happen in order for that to occur?
I love that question.
Right? So that one is definitely going to get people to, know what their role is, what their responsibilities are. And then the second one is, now some of our people are, many of them are running their own practices, or and so then, financial advisors, they have you have clients. So, with you, same thing you can ask your client is, and look, we just finished a review. Well, out of a scale of 1 to 10, 1, this review was not, you're extremely dissatisfied, to 10, you were extremely satisfied. What would you rate this review? And if they give you a 7 or 8, just ask them, okay, what will it take to move it to a 9 or a 10 next year? Now, remember, the truth will set you free, but first it's going to make you miserable. So that comes down to step 2 here. Step 2, a lot of reasons why people won't even take step 1, because they won't set aside their pride. And remember, pride cometh before the fall. And what it looks like here, if you need help, you don't have all the necessary skills, or and I say skills and the will, as you described it, Dan. Skills, we'll talk about ability, and will is, is your motivation to do these tasks, ask for help. And if you've done it and you've screwed up in the past, well, admit it, and that's why you're having this conversation. Taking personal responsibility, another one of our values that we've studied, as people remembers, the byproduct of that, if you take personal responsibility, it's inspirational. But that leads us to step 3. So, as we mentioned, if you did screw up and you're taking personal responsibility, and we talked about this in the values podcast on forgiveness. Say you're sorry. Make sure it's sincere. Right the wrong. And then more importantly, promise you're never going to do it again. But Dan, you bring up the next one, step 4. And we just talked to Mike, who's going to be a future guest on here, former president of Ameritrade. Look, your number one currency, and you've got to be so careful with it, is time. So you got to decide, am I going to invest my time or am I going to spend my time? So use your time wisely. Prioritize those tasks. As you Dan, you said what you witnessed and observed. They make it seem so easy. Good leaders, but they're disciplined. They start their meetings on time. They end on time. They realize there's always going to be more work than there is going to be time. They've got an agenda. They stick to it. By the way, if there is no agenda for the meeting, I'm not in. Don't count me out. I'm not going to waste my time. But what I would encourage you to do, even if you're a self practitioner here, and you're running and you're orchestrating your own talents and resources at the beginning of every morning or at the end of every day, before you shut your office lights off, write down what are your must-do activities for that day or the next day if you're doing it at the end of the day. And your must-do activities, those are the things that one needs to do in order to achieve their goals. But then, step 5, don't overcommit. Learn to say no. And step 6, remember we said earlier, this change it's slow. You generally don't see it. It's kind of like trying to turn that Titanic around in the ocean. It takes miles to turn it around. But if you make progress, a degree here, a degree there, every couple months, or 5 degrees in 1 year, but over time, it's amazing. But ask yourself this question. It's the self-reflection. Remember, questions are the answers. What could I do differently? And what did I learn today?
Now, would you also suggest, one thing that came to mind as you were mentioning that is that idea of the single practitioner, independent business owner, also maybe an employee who has a manager like me who wasn't super on top of their own self-discipline. Would you suggest seeking out an accountability partner? That has worked for me in the past.
Oh, I think yes.
Yeah, find another business owner, maybe even somebody in a different industry, and just have a weekly or bi-weekly chat with them to keep each other on task, or go as far as working with a coach. We're gonna have
Todd, one of our good friends, and we've hired him out to help us and former organizations united facilitate our business planning. It's not that we couldn't do it, but it's difficult to wear 2 hats. You got to put your leadership hat on, then you got to be a facilitator hat on. Sometimes it's better to have someone come in, an outside person like a coach, who sees things differently and will and really be a truth teller and hold you accountable. So I would agree with that wholeheartedly, Dan. Get someone else, and someone who's achieving what it is you want for yourself. And just remember during this whole process, and I'll finish with this and turn it over to you, but just remember, we're all perfectly imperfect. So be kind to yourself as you're going through this. Change is gradual. And the most important thing to learn is to feed the good wolf, the one that provides you that joy, that peace, that love, hope, serenity, humility, truth, compassion, and faith. And we've mentioned this one too before, is empathy. Um, feed feed the good wolf, and over time you're going to be happier with yourself. And with that, Dan, that's self discipline. Start with that one.
It's funny you mentioned the idea of having that list of things at the end of every day. I have a post-it note that I update every day, and it's got just a couple of different things that I see as the key tasks for the podcast and for our business. And I tell you, at the end of the day, when I get ready to go to bed and I look at that, it really is helpful to make me feel like I'm on course, to know that, hey, you know what? I did send out those emails. I
Yes,
did,
great example.
check up on the Twitter feed. I did do a number of the things that are on my list each day. And that is a huge part of being, I mean, especially as a independent business owner, is having that framework to know at the end of the day, because sometimes it's hard to, when you're on your own, and especially in this environment today where you're not having a lot of human activity and we're not out seeing people constantly, you can get to the end of the day and feel like, man, where am I going, what am I doing? So having those goals and those little steps, that's actually a great transition into our article review for the week,
Oh,
actually. So
perfect.
let's go ahead and make that transition into our article review. The article is Goals-Based Financial Planning, A Poor Path to Financial Success. Of course, we'll put a link to the article on Twitter and Facebook. You can find links to both of those at value-ability.com under the Contact Us tab. And then we will also put a link to it on the website as well, value-ability.com under the content tab. There is a link to the article for the week. I'll go ahead and start out. Essentially, this article makes the point that the goals side of financial planning is not as important as making clients understand their cash flow situation. And it is making the argument that if you focus on the cash flow side of things, that's where, getting to a point where your sources of income can support your expenses is what allows you to, achieve the things that you want to achieve later in life. And that, you know what, when you're 20, you don't know what your goals are going to be when you're 60. And so, the approach of, hey, what do you want to do when you're 60, just isn't relevant. And I just have to start out by saying I cannot disagree more. I absolutely understand the point that she's making about not that many people don't talk about cash flow. But to me, that's really more the struggle at getting people to understand their own budgets. It's really challenging, as you know, to get people to sit down and figure out, now, how much money are they spending on food? How much money are they spending on gas, and so on and so forth. But the idea that just because your goals are going to change, goals based financial planning doesn't work. I think it's just absurd. Like
Hmm.
the very basis. I was reading another white paper that was talking about concepts of behavioral finance. The idea of having a future goal psychologically allowing you to actualize behaviors today is an intrinsic part of success. And so I understand that, yes, if what you're saying, you refer to it as financial planning by the pound, right? The, hey, we're going to do this plan and then throw it on the shelf and we're done. And 15 years later, we come back and look at it. That doesn't work.
Nope.
Absolutely.
Ag- Wholeheartedly agree, and that's the same thing that she's making a point of, if that's the case. But you and I know, and you've said it before, Dan. Financial planning is not empirical science; it is a social science, and that's why you need to have these reviews and keep continuously updating. So,
And that is a huge gap, actually, not to toot our own horn, but our first product on our consulting company is a module on client reviews. It is a weakness in our industry, absolutely. But I really think it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater to say, well, because reviews aren't done, goals based financial planning doesn't work. No. If you do the reviews, the goals based financial planning is fine. The other point that she makes that's important, and it dovetails, of course, nicely with our message, is that it's easier to achieve those goals if those goals are attached to your values, which is people are going to get sick and tired of us beating that drum. But the idea that like we're not going to be successful, so we'll just stop doing it, just doesn't make any sense to me. The fixing is in the way you're implementing it, not in the process
right,
itself.
right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. I just would reiterate and I guess piggyback onto what you said. You, and I think many advisors and people don't understand what their clients' top five values are. And by helping them figure out what their top five values are, and your top 15 values don't change over your lifetime, the priority of them will. But if we figure out what their key values are and align those with their goals, then that's going to help you as their advisor, as their coach, make better decisions along the way. And she's right. Life is it's dynamic. It's not static. There's going to be birth. We had today. There's going to be deaths. There's going to be pay raises. There's going to be bonuses. There's going to be layoffs. There's going to be inheritances. All those things. That's why you need to establish the reviews. And I know it's a shameless plug, and people will be able to see our product coming up soon. But that's why we labeled it client service with purpose, creating your competitive immunity.
Well, and I'm probably the greatest example of that. At 45, I decided that I
Yeah.
was going to stop doing the career that I had been in for 20 years and change course. I would not in any way have been able to do that had I not established goals with you at 22. And just because those goals changed when I got to be 45, I still had resources available to apply to those goals, even though those goals have changed drastically. And I've started using some of my retirement funds earlier in my life than I ever expected. But having that goal and that plan allowed me when I was 45 to achieve that. So I think, yes, the goals can change, but in the end, most of our goals are probably going to require money, right?
Hmm.
So if your goal does change, you want to have the resources. You talk about it all the time, right? How do you phrase it? The freedom to make work optional,
Oh yeah, for retirement, financial independence is when work is optional and retirement's affordable.
right? And that as your overarching goal then allows you a lot of different ways to implement that. That I think is the fun part of being a financial advisor, is helping people explore what does that mean for their individual lifestyle. So, any other thoughts before we wrap up?
No, great hearing your voice. Thanks for a good session. Thank you to our
Awesome.
listeners. Appreciate it if you keep passing us on. If you found you got
Absolutely.
any value to this, because that's how we win, is getting people to is Don. Take it away, Dan. And what can they do to help us selfishly?
Absolutely. If you have topics that you would like us to cover or questions for us, you can reach out to us. Email at info@value-ability.com. Again, that's info@value-ability.com. Or you can find all of our social media links, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, all at value-ability.com under the Contact Us tab. Wherever you find our podcast, be it Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or we now have a big group of listeners on Amazon Music, please like, review, subscribe, and share. If you prefer to listen to us on YouTube, we have a YouTube channel. Search Value-Ability on YouTube to find us there. Or you can always find us on our website, value-ability.com, under the Episodes tab. Next episode, as we briefly mentioned, we have Todd Mowney, president of ROI Coaching Solutions, a good friend of ours, coming on to talk about building high-performance teams in a virtual world. That is going to be episode 50. Our, is that the silver anniversary 50 or the gold?
Jubilee, brother.
I think it might be the gold.
The silver is the 25th.
Silver's 25, gold is 50. So,
Yeah, baby.
and then we will come back after that and finish up the last of our values-based episodes in this set of 3. We had patience and discipline today, and we are going to follow that up with humility. What have been your biggest challenges, either as a leader or a team member, in working in the current environment during the pandemic? Reach out to us so we can chat with Todd in the next episode about your questions. Until then, thank you for listening. Be sure to join us next week. And remember that financial success comes from creating a plan on the foundation of your values, and building your ability will get you there. This is a podcast collaboration, not a peer-reviewed journal or a sponsored publication. We make no representations as to accuracy, completeness, correctness, suitability, or validity of any information in this podcast, and will not be liable for any errors, omissions, or delays in this information, or any losses, injuries, or damages arising from its display or use. All information is provided on an as-is basis. It is the listener's responsibility to verify their own facts. You should be aware of the real risk of loss in following any strategy or investment discussed on this podcast. Strategies or investments discussed may fluctuate in price or value. Investors may get back less than invested. Investments or strategies mentioned on this podcast may not be suitable for you. This material does not take into account your particular investment objectives, financial situation, or needs, and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for you. You must make an independent decision regarding investments or strategies mentioned on this podcast. Before acting on information on this podcast, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances, and strongly consider seeking advice from your own financial or investment advisor. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company. Assumptions are not reflective of the position of any entity other than the authors, and since we are critically thinking human beings, these views are always subject to change, revision, and rethinking at any time. Please do not hold us to them in perpetuity.